Hey Sonos, thank you for the great release of Sonos 15.2 firmware and the S2 software update. It is good. Now, take a look at my screen here. Okay, you can see that I am playing an Atmos track directly from Apple Music servers. And you will see the glorious Dolby Atmos badge on the lower right of the now playing screen. Now the Era 300 is playing Atmos music right now as we speak. It is at volume 1, so you don't really hear it. But before I go on to the rest of the video, Sonos, let me just say something to you. If you ever mess up this sound profile again, I will call you out. I mean it. Like you messed up the sound from 14.12 update last year. Don't ever do that again. From 14.18, it was good. Now this version at 15.2 is great. So don't mess it up. Really, do not mess it up, right? Okay, so hey guys, this was a really busy week for the Sonos community. Most of us who ordered the Era 100 and the Era 300 speakers would have taken delivery of their new speakers within the past couple of days, within the past week. Now, there were two other events that took place which were seemingly unrelated. Yeah, but they're actually related. They share the same goal and the same purpose, and that is to make your Sonos sound system sound better. First was the update of Sonos S2 app itself and the firmware version to 15.2. And second is that Apple is now allowing for Sonos to pull Atmos music tracks from their streaming service. Now the question is, do we upgrade to Sonos S2 15.2 firmware? And as with all my other videos, I like to give you my upfront summary so you don't have to stay for the entire video to get your answer. And the answer is yes, you can upgrade. There are no major issues and it brings about major functionalities and features to Sonos users. The most important being the ability for users of the Sonos Arc, the Beam Gen 2, and the Era 300 to pull Dolby Atmos soundtracks directly from the Sonos S2 app itself. Now, second, some supported speakers will now show up information on the Wi-Fi connection that helps you if you are troubleshooting connectivity issue. And lastly, a small usability update is to change how you group speakers. Now, Sonos allows you to change the volume of the speaker that you are going to group before you actually group it. So that's my upfront summary for today. Now I understand that there are some users with issues here and there with 15.2. I can't guarantee that everybody will have a good time trying to update your system. I can only tell you what I personally am experiencing. And for this 15.2 update, I've had absolutely no issues. So if you're going to be staying around for the rest of the video, let's chat a little bit about Sonos updates. For the whole of the year 2022, Sonos has adopted a monthly update to the firmware and the software version. Every third Tuesday or so of the month, they release a version, and most of the time, the release notes will read bug fixes and performance enhancements. Not very helpful, not very exciting. And someone was seemingly just releasing stuff on a schedule because the manager said to release stuff on a schedule. Now, worse still, sometimes it broke things. Like TruePlay was broken for 3 months before they fixed it, and that nerfed the sub output for a lot of users, me truly included. It wasn't pleasant at all. Now, Sonos, we want quality of updates, not quantity. For those of you who agree, type quality, not quantity down in the comment section below. If there's nothing to update, then don't do it. Now, users with extensive Sonos setup in the home, trying to update every month, it wasn't funny. I'm counting like 28 Sonos devices in my house, and updating them takes a long time. Okay, so let me see. I've got 3 Sonos 5s, 2 times subs, 2 sub mini, 1 Arc, 1 Beam Gen 1, 1 Beam Gen 2, 2 Play 1s, 2 Sonos 1s, 2 Play 3s, 1 Sonos M, 2 IKEA picture frames, 2 IKEA lamps, 2 IKEA bookshelf speakers, 1 Sonos Roam, 2 Era 100, and finally 2 Era 300. So this really took a very long time for me. And by the way, I just learned that there is a limit of 32 Sonos devices on your network, so I'm going to breach that pretty soon. Now, okay, so let's get back to what I'm trying to tell Sonos, right? My advice is this: if you truly have something great to roll out, yes, please roll it out. If it is not ready, test and fix it first. We are not your testers. Now you have to test it first, make sure that it works perfectly before you roll it out. Most of us didn't sign up to be Sonos beta testers. Make us look forward to an update, right? Not make us fear an update. Like me, a lot of users have already turned off auto updates for fear of the system getting mucked up and broken with your updates. So Sonos has done some pretty good updates in the past, like, enabling dual sub support. Now, things like that makes for meaningful updates and functionalities and bring new features to the Sonos home users. Now, so please just roll out the updates. Make sure that the experience is heightened with each update. Make the great hardware shine with each update, not make it worse. So I want to talk a little bit more in detail about this particular 15.2 update. I will clear two small updates first before we talk about the big one, which has got to do with Atmos and sound quality. So the first small update, which has got to do with quality of life update, is the app being able to display information on the network connection. Now, Sonos did state that this update is going to be gradually rolled out over the following weeks. Right now, I can go into the system to see connectivity information for the Era 100 and the Era 300, as well as one of my Sonos 5 speakers. So I've got two Sonos 5 speakers, and strangely, one of them you can see connectivity information and the other you cannot. I don't know why. Now, the Arc and the Beam Gen 2 and all the older hardwares did not get the information as well. Even the 6 months old Sub Mini hasn't gotten it yet. But what I find strange is that one of the Sonos 5s has it disabled and not the other one. Now, they were both on the same firmware version, so it's making me wonder whether there are hardware differences between the two supposedly identical Sonos 5 models. Now, maybe this is the progressive rollout that Sonos is talking about. Most users actually won't need this feature. So you will probably just want to use it every once in a while or when setting up a new speaker to check on the connectivity. Now, it's not something that you will use on a daily or regular basis. Good to have, but won't change much for most users. The second small update for quality of life is that of the grouping process. Now, previously, when you try to group speakers into your current playing group, it will use the previously set volume and play at the volume on the new group speaker. Now, with the 15.2 update, two things happen. First, when you choose the room that you want to group together, it will float up to the top of the selection list. Next, you will be able to then set the volume first before sound actually comes out when you click on the Done button. Now, again, not a big deal, but it does save one step of later going in to adjust the volume independently if they are not in sync. Now that we've cleared the two small feature updates, let's get to the big one. Atmos and sound improvements. Now, there is a slight change to the sound, not so much of a sound profile change, but there are some tweaks to the volume levels. Now, I did not manage to do a frequency sweep comparison. It was quite a busy week at work, but the volume change is actually noticeable enough without actually having to measure it. You can actually hear it yourself. Even at the lower volumes, it is quite obvious that things are playing a little bit hotter, a little bit louder. Now, this is actually evident in the bass region. Now, most of you would have noticed that playing at the same volume as you were familiar before version 15.2, things on your Sonos speakers are going to be sounding a tad louder, just a little bit louder. Now, this is a good thing, but I think that Sonos might want to implement a slightly less linear volume curve at the lowest volumes, like between volume 1 and 5, right, out of a scale of 100 volume. For those ultra low level volume settings, make it such that they sound proportionately softer than the rest of the volume curve. Now, this is so that you're able to adjust it to the exact volume that you want without it being too loud, because believe it or not, there might be situations when even volume 1 is too loud, especially if you are used to falling asleep with some music playing in the background. You don't want volume 1 to be any louder than what it is now. All right, so now we are on to the most important change in this update. Sonos S2 app and the Beam Gen 2, the Arc, as well as the Era 300 is now able to pull Atmos soundtracks from Apple Music services. Note that this is the only proper way to do it. You can't just play the Atmos track on Apple Music on your iPhone and have it sent to the Era 300 over AirPlay 2. AirPlay does not support Atmos soundtracks. There is not enough bandwidth on AirPlay to do it. Now, there was actually a way to get Apple Music over the Sonos Arc that I have here, and even the Beam Gen 2 in the past, but it required the use of Apple TV 4K connected to an Atmos capable TV screen, and then having that TV screen connected to an Arc or a Beam Gen 2. Now this meant that whenever you want to listen to Atmos music, you had to turn on all three devices and you had to leave the TV on, because the moment you turn the TV on, the soundbar would turn off, right? This was a big waste of electricity. Now, not only that, you were left with the TV processing the Atmos sound. There's a slight difference in the TV rendering of the Atmos sounds played from the Apple TV music app as opposed to having it directly streamed. Now, some TVs have passed through, and this was then sent over to the Sonos Arc and Beam Gen 2 for processing. And when you're using that method, you could not have sent it to the Era 300 anyway, because the Era 300 doesn't have a HDMI input port. Now, yes, you might be able to get TV sound out of through Bluetooth or analog line out with a suitable dongle, because the Era 300 supports those dongles, right? But that won't be Atmos. It will just be stereo. Not to mention that there will be a slight lag. But all this is now in the past, because with Sonos 15.2 update, you are now able to get Atmos music tracks direct from Apple Music streaming service without the Apple TV and without the Atmos capable TV. Just an internet connection to your Era 300 or the Sonos Arc or the Beam Gen 2. Okay, so what am I trying to say? In short, your Sonos Arc, Beam Gen 2 and Era 300 is now able to stream Dolby Atmos music tracks from Apple Music and Amazon Music HD, which isn't available in Singapore actually. So on to the most important point, how does all this sound? There are a few important pointers that I have to make here, but most important point up front, well, I kind of like Dolby Atmos rendition of some music, but not all. Now, let me further explain. So on Tuesday night, right, when they came out with the update, I came back home from work, and as I expected, the Sonos update was waiting. So there are two parts to the update. First, the app update. Once the app update is done, relaunching the app will prompt you to update the firmware version on all your connected Sonos speakers. Now, this step might take a while, especially if you have like 28 Sonos speakers to update. Now, in my previous video, when I was testing out the Era 300 for music, I was left a little bit disappointed. I told you guys that the Era 300 was very well suited for surround duties, but music made the Era 300 sound very diffuse, right? Like all the drivers were firing at the same time, and all the vocals, all the voices, all the soundstage and the treble bass, everything was firing all around from all 6 drivers. It felt like one of those JBL party speakers where fidelity and soundstage was secondary. It's like the only thing that mattered to the Era 300 was to fill the entire room with sound from all directions. Now, the vocal tracks for the music was projected throughout the entire room from all 6 drivers. Every bass note, every detail was similarly replicated throughout all the 6 drivers in the Era 300. I then paired the Era 300 in stereo. The problem persisted, as made worse by the fact that now there are 12 mono channels all firing throughout all 12 drivers. To the front, 2 upwards, 4 to the left, 4 to the right. And it was a complete hot mess. But that was before the 15.2 update. That was before Sonos S2 app was pulling Atmos music streams from Apple Music. Now, that was, I suspect, before the Era 300 even knew how to handle Atmos music. Now, the Era 300 was on 15.1.1. Now, Sonos was really cutting this very, very close. The update was scheduled on the 28th of March, and the deliveries were made on the 28th of March. So, yes, but whenever you set up Sonos speakers, you will be forced to update. And by right, most people would hear the proper rendition of Atmos music, Atmos tracks on the Era 300 when they get their speakers. But because I had the Era 300 slightly earlier than most of you, I had a chance to hear the Era 300 on version 15.1.1. And thankfully, I was of sound mind to preempt you guys that my impression might change after the update. And change it did. Right now, I'm still deciding if I like Atmos renditions better or traditional stereo rendition better. But to summarize my recommendation, I would like to say that if you are after pure stereo fidelity, the Sonos 5s, they do a much better job than the Era 300. If you are into Atmos music reproduction and you like what Atmos does to your music, then the Era 300s are the ones to get. Now, let me explain that a little bit. So I have two charts on the screen right now. The red curve shows the frequency response for the Sonos 5s, and the green curve shows the frequency response for the Era 300. Now, from where my mic is, which is up there, the Era 300 is actually directing more sounds to the mic because of the speaker placement. This is evident from the fact that the range of frequencies where both speakers are producing with ease, you can see the difference there. The Era will end up being louder. You can see the green curve is trending higher throughout than the 5s from about 80-85 Hz onwards. So that means that if you were to be sitting at the same place where the mic is, there are more drivers directing sound towards you. Now the 5s, they have 6 drivers, all firing to the front, roughly to the front. There are 2 tweeters at the side, which are angled very aggressively left and right, but they're still on the front faceplate of the Sonos 5. Now, the Era 300 has 6 drivers as well, but only one of them is firing on the front plate. There's one firing upwards on the top, and the rest of the 4 drivers are actually to the sides. There are 2 more here and 2 more here. One bass, one tweeter, one bass, one tweeter, firing to the left and the right. Now, the Era casts more sounds, right, everywhere else, all right, except the front, whereas the 5s are casting all the sounds towards the front. Now, in traditional music mixes, the sound engineering took care of this, right? Because almost all speakers in the world made in the last century assumes that drivers were firing forward. And that sound reproduction took that into consideration. Of the millions and millions of music tracks that aren't Atmos to you, streaming to you right now, they were all assuming that you had speakers with drivers firing forward. Now, when such traditional mixes are played on Atmos speakers with drivers all around, they create sound in all directions, and the soundstage is completely messed up, which is why I won't recommend the Era 300 if you are listening to pure stereo music. But when the Atmos music is correctly coded, properly coded, and the decoder, in this case the Era 300, understands the layout of the drivers and where it needs to fire the specific sounds, which driver to use, then the soundstage is advanced to levels which cannot be achieved through traditional speakers with only front-firing drivers. Now, this is truly the epitome of soundstage rather. Now, with an Era 300 updated to 15.2 software, you are also able to adjust the height effects, the height channel volume of Atmos soundtracks. Now, for most parts over the last couple of days, I simply maxed out and I was at +10 for height setting. I was thoroughly enjoying the heightened sensation of Atmos music on the Era 300. But there is one small issue. Now, if you compare the size of the Sonos 5s with the Era 300, you will notice that the Era 300 is a lot smaller. And when it comes to sound reproduction size, it does matter, especially if you are trying to reproduce bass, right? The 5s has 3 bass drivers, and all of the bass drivers are larger than the 2 bass drivers on the Era 300, which are firing sideways. Now, let's refer to the frequency response chart again, right? Looking at the region below 80 Hz, you'll notice that the 5s are superior at reproducing bass. There's simply no replacement for displacement. Now, in fact, the levels of bass produced at 30 Hz is about 3 times as loud as the Era 300, a good 10 dB or so louder. So Atmos or not, soundstage or not, the Era 300 is simply not going to be producing as much bass as the 5s. So Herein lies the dilemma. If you ask me, there are different reasons why you want the 5 or why you prefer the Era 300. They sound different. The 5s will excel at traditional music and does bass very well, so well that it doesn't even require a subwoofer. Now the Era is all about soundstage, and if you are listening to properly well-coded Atmos tracks, you are going to enjoy it even more. Now, to overcome the bass deficiencies on the Era 300, you could pair it with a Sonos Sub Gen 3 or a Sub Mini, but then again, you'll end up spending a lot more, right? But you almost have a system that has the best of both worlds of soundstage as well as the bass augmented by the subwoofer. Now, I have to caveat that you have to listen to it yourself, because not all traditional stereo music lovers are going to like the Atmos rendition coming out of Era, or any Atmos speakers for that matter. Now, there's a small misunderstanding that needs to be cleared with the Era 300, which may or may not be an issue with the 15.2 update. Now, that is the center driver on the Era 300, and it's specific when the Era 300 is being used as surround. When you pair the Era 300 as surrounds to the Sonos or the Beam Gen 2, the surround sounds are played through 5 of its drivers, right? The one on top for Atmos surrounds, and the 4 at the sides for side surrounds and the rear surrounds. The center driver, which is this one here, is disabled. Why? Well, a lot of users are unhappy, right, with that. Why is the center channel, center driver disabled? Now, if you paid for all 6 drivers, you want all 6 drivers firing. Like if you bought a V6 engine in your car, you obviously want all 6 cylinders firing, not 5. Now, let's be clear about one thing, right? One thing. When you are using the Era 300 as stereo speakers or standalone playing music, the center driver on the front is playing. It is in use. It is used to project vocals and voices, and whatever needs to come out from the front of you, it is being used. But when you use them in surrounds, the front driver is then disabled, only as surrounds. But why disable it? Now, when I first used and heard the Era 300 as surrounds, I noticed 2 things. First, the surround sound stage is complete, right? There are no gaps and no holes in the surround sound stage when sounds pan around you. The transition of sound from the front to the sides to the rear and then to the other side and back to the front, it is smooth. And the second thing I realized is that I don't get a pinpoint location of where the surround speaker is anymore. I don't get the feeling that there is a surround speaker to my rear left or the rear right playing sounds from a specific location. It was no longer bringing attention to itself and irritating me by mere fact of me knowing where the sound is coming from. Every speaker that could have been used as surrounds in the past, the Play 1s, the Play 3s, the 5s, IKEA, any of the IKEA speakers, all had sounds coming from the front and from one pinpoint source. And because of that, you will always notice that the sounds are emanating from a specific location behind you. The surround sound stage had holes and gaps in between the surrounds and the soundbar, and it had gaps between the surround speakers at the rear as well. So when Sonos disables the center driver, when they are being used as surround speakers, they removed that issue. Basically, they solved a problem. They didn't take away something and they didn't create a new problem. There are now no sounds directly pointing at you and distracting you anymore. The level of distraction is actually real. So imagine you had the speakers close to you, and in a lot of homes, that's going to be the case because the surrounds are going to be nearer where you are sitting than the soundbar is, right? And they're going to be quite close to your ears. TruePlay will reduce that levels somehow because they are near to you, but when they do that, it creates a much leaner surround soundstage, and the sweet spot for surround will then be a lot smaller. So if this is a feature of 15.2, which I think it is, then it is good for me. I do believe that it is good for you as well. There's chatter online that says that this is not a good thing. Sonos might enable the standard driver in a future update, but I think this is not going to be beneficial. So guys, if you think that you're being shortchanged, that the standard drivers are not firing, think again. this is probably something that we want in the first place. Now, in fact, why don't we reverse things a little bit? Imagine that 15.2 and the Era 300 were launched with the center driver in use. We might end up feeling that, oh, it is very jarring. The center channel is pointing at my ears. And we might ask Sonos to, reduce the distraction and disable the center channel. And given that the Era 300s are a suitably much more powerful speaker than the Sonos ones, which are being used as surround speakers quite a lot, you do want them to actually remove that driver that is blaring into your ears. So I sincerely think that this is a good decision on Sonos' part. Now give it some time. If you like how they perform as surround, there's no need to get hung up over the fact that one of the drivers isn't firing, especially if it is for a good reason. So we've come to the end of the video. It's been a long video. I didn't expect this video to be this long, but the Era 300 is truly an important speaker. Now, bear in mind, in Singapore, the first shipment has already been sold out. The Era 300 isn't the first speaker to play Atmos music. The HomePods, they already did that. Apple is releasing the HomePods Gen 2 in Singapore, and I've already ordered them. So I will be comparing the performance of the Era 300 against the HomePods. Now, if you are interested in that video, do stay subscribed to the channel. If you're not already subscribed, subscribe and stay tuned. I'll see you over in that video if it is already available. Otherwise, check out one of my other videos on the Sonos Era 300 or the Sonos Era 100.